Today we're going to start to learn to complete the square. In order to do this is just another way of solving quadratic equations. We learned one method is factoring, and the second method is completing the square. So the first step is to put your x squared equation in this form, where you have your x squared, then your x, then we're going to have a blank, and then we're going to have our equals, our constant, plus another blank, because what we're doing is we're actually balancing out the equation. In order to figure out what goes in this blank right here, we are going to take and find the b, and we'll take half of the b and we'll square it, and that will be what goes in here. The reason why that works is because what we're looking for is those perfect square trinomials, and we can get more into that as we do some problems. The third step is to place that into each side, and then what we're going to do is we're going to factor the left-hand side, we'll square root it, and then we'll solve for x, and most of the time we'll get two answers. It'll make more sense after we do a couple problems. So here's problem number 1. The first step is to get it into that form where we have x squared minus 4x plus, I'm going to use a box instead of a blank, equals 5 plus that same blank. So we have our x terms on one side and our constant on the other. The way you come up with what goes inside the box is by looking at this middle term b, taking the b term off to the side and saying, well, b is 4. It's actually negative 4, but we won't really concern ourselves with that too much, because what happens when you take half of it, so you have to take half of b, you get negative 2, but every time you go and you square that, it becomes positive. That's why it's not that important that you think about whether it's a positive 4 or a negative 4, because when you square it, it becomes positive every time. So we're going to have 4, and to balance out the equation, I have to put 4 on the other side. The next step is to factor this. Every time it factors, it will factor where you get x times x, 2 times 2, and then you have to figure out you need a minus and a minus, because that will give you your negative 2 and your negative 2. My point being is if you don't get the same thing inside the parentheses on these, then you haven't done the first part correctly. So you should always get it to factor into the same set of parentheses. And then on the right hand side we have 5 plus 4, which is 9. What we're going to do is we're going to write this together as a single quantity squared. That allows me to do step number 5, which is square root each side. Square rooting each side gives me x minus 2, because the square and the square root cancel each other out. And then the square root of 9 is plus or minus 3. Remember, 3 times 3 is 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Last thing is to solve for x, so we just add 2 to both sides. And then we get our answer of, I always like to write the 2 first, and then the plus or minus afterwards. Let's go ahead and figure out what each of these are. 2 plus 3 is 5. There's one of my answers. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. So I'm going to go back through these steps one more time before I do any more examples. So the first step was to have your x's on one side plus a box equals the constant plus a box. You can see I did that. X's on one side, box equals constant plus a box. Second step is to figure out what goes inside the box. So you do that by taking half of b and squaring it. You see I did that off to the side. I found my b, took half of it, and then I squared it. That's what goes in the box. The third step is to factor. Okay, well, let's put that in there, and then to factor both sides, factor the left-hand side. I did that, and then I wrote it as a single quantity. The fifth step was to square root each side, and the sixth solve for x. So I square rooted both sides, and then I solve for x. You'll see some more examples in the next video. Alright, second example, we're going to go through the steps again. All the x's stay on one side. It already is separated that way. So I'll make my box equals 10 and I'll balance it out with the box on the other side. Figure out what goes in the box. I take my b term, which is 6. It's actually a negative 6, but as I said, it doesn't really matter. Take half of it, which is 3, and then square it, and I get 9. So 9 is what goes in the box on both sides. Next step is to factor the left-hand side. So you put x times x, 3 times 3. I need a negative 6, so I need a negative 3 and a negative 3. Equals, this is 19. We'll write it together as a single quantity squared. Next step is to square root both sides. That gives me x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 19. I don't know the square root of 19, so we'll just leave it the square root of 19. And then I'll add 3 to both sides. We're actually going to leave our answer as 3 plus or minus the square root of 19. It may read 3 plus the square root of 19 and 3 minus the square root of 19, or you can just leave it in this form, which is the form I'm going to leave it in. The next example, you can see it's not set up in proper form, so the first thing I need to do is move this 4 to the other side. So I have x squared plus 4x plus the box equals negative 4 plus the box. Look at your b term, which is a 4. Take half of it and then square it. That gives you 4 that goes in the box. When you factor the left-hand side, it will factor into x plus 2, x plus 2. There's your 2x and your 2x. Negative 4 plus 4 is 0. Write it together as a single quantity squared. And then square root each side. X plus 2 equals the square root of 0 is 0. Subtract 2, and we get x is equal to negative 2. So this is why I meant most of the time we'll get 2 answers, but sometimes we'll just get a single answer. Okay, let's look at this next example. I've got to have all my x's on one side and my number on the other. So I've got x squared minus x squared minus 8x. I need to move my 4 to the other side. And go ahead and put in my box on both sides so the equation is balanced. What goes inside the box is we have to take half of b, and then we have to square it. So I put 16 on each side, and then factor x times x. 4 times 4 gives you 16. I need a negative 8. So a negative 4 and a negative 4. 4 plus 16 is 20. Write it as a single quantity squared, and then square root each side. So I end up with x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Now, unlike this last example, or those examples before that, I didn't know the square root of 19. I didn't talk about how it couldn't be broken down because it was already prime number. 20 can be broken down into some other factors. It can be broken down into 4 times 5 and 2 times 2, like you've seen in the previous videos. Remember that the pair comes on the outside and the single stays on the inside. So we actually get x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus 2 square root of 5. Then what I need to do is add 4 to both sides so I can come up with my final answer of 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 5. So there's 2 answers here, 4 plus 2 square root of 5 and 4 minus 2 square root of 5. I have 2 more examples for this section, and this first one again is not in proper form, so I'm going to move my 6 to the other side. I've got x squared plus 5x plus, I'm going to make my box here, equals negative 6 plus the box. So what I'm going to do on this one is a little bit more challenging because I have a 5 in here. So I'm going to take my b off to the side. I'm going to take half of b. That makes actually 5 halves. I'm going to leave it as that fraction form. It'll make it a little bit easier to work with later. When I square that, 5 squared is 25. 2 times 2 is 4. So I'm actually putting in 25/4 on both sides. Now what happens, people will say, I don't know how to factor this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go backwards to these other slides, the other ones we saw previously. If you look, each time we factored, what went inside the factored form was whatever the 1/2 b was. So if you look at this example, you can see that the 4 went in there. If you look at this example, the 2 went in there. And if you look at this previous example, the 1/2 b was 3, and it went in there. So if I take that and use that knowledge, what I can actually say is that this is going to factor into x times x, and then here's my 1/2 b, so it's 5/2 and 5/2. Well, 5/2 is 2.5 and 2.5. So you can see 2.5 and 2.5 will give you a 5. So it does factor correctly. In order to work with the right-hand side, we need a common denominator. Well, -6 is -24 over 4. -24 plus 25 is a 1/4. So I'll write this as a single quantity squared, and then I'll square root both sides. So I end up getting x plus 5/2 equals plus or minus 1/2. Square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 4 is 2. Then the last step is to move your 5/2 over, so I'm going to subtract 5/2 from both sides. So minus 5/2 plus or minus 1/2. Now I can actually figure out both those answers. I've got negative 5/2 plus 1/2 and negative 5/2 minus 1/2. This one will give me the answer of negative 4 over 2, which is equal to negative 2. So there's one of my answers. This one gives me the answer of negative 6 over 2, which is a negative 3. So my two answers are negative 2 and negative 3. Last example from this video, I've got x squared minus 7x plus a box equals 0 plus the box. My b is 7, my 1/2 b is 7/2, and then my 1/2 b squared is 49 over 4. So I'm be placing 49 over 4 into both of the boxes. The left-hand side will factor. Remember, when you have that fraction, you can look for your 1/2 b, so it's 7/2. I needed a negative 7, so it's a minus minus. I'll write it as a single quantity squared, and then we're ready to square root each side. So I get x minus 7/2 is equal to the square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of 4 is 2. So I'll add 7/2 to both sides, and I'll end up getting 7/2 plus or minus 7/2. That allows me to, I can actually figure out both of these. I get 7/2 plus 7/2 and 7/2 minus 7/2. 7/2 minus 7/2 is 0, so there's one of my answers. This one gives me 14 over 2. 14 over 2 is a positive 7. So 0 and 7 are my two solutions.